Good evening. In the spirit of Sex and the City, I had this handbag made to go with my book. I can take the little patch off after I'm done with the book tour. I'm very practical. I'm gonna read a little bit from my new book, Killing Monica. And Killing Monica, some people think it's autobiographical, which it's not. But it is about a writer who, when she was a little girl, she created this character called Monica for the entertainment of herself and her younger sister. And when she grew up and left her not very happy childhood behind, she thought she was also leaving Monica behind. But one night in New York, on a dark and stormy night, when she was down and out, she decided to resurrect Monica. And of course, Monica ends up becoming a big hit and ends up being, the main character in 4 novels and then in 4 movies. So the book is about Pandy's relationship with Monica. And it's really, in a sense, about, in this day and age, how we all create a Monica, which is, I keep saying like, Monica, I don't know why. But we all create a Monica, which is the better version of ourselves that we present to the world. And Monica's always happy, she's always smiling, and nothing bad ever happens to Monica. So in a sense, Monica is, she's like a sort of protection against the realities of the world. And the main character, the writer, P.J. Wallace, I really wanted to explore creativity. And for her, she feels like her creativity will always save her. And at the beginning of the book, she has decided to write something different, a different book that's not about Monica, because she feels like now is the time, and she's gone through a really bad divorce, so she has taken all of her creative energy and written a historical novel, which is not about Monica, and she knows it's a big risk. So I'm going to read a little bit, and she has all these crazy friends who to me are like Real Housewives types. I'm gonna read a little bit from the beginning of the book when, after 2 years, Pandy has emerged from behind her computer and she's turned in her manuscript, and her divorce lawyer has just called her and said that her ex-husband, Johnny Balaga, who is a famous chef, has agreed to the terms of the divorce. So she's just handed in her book and she's finally free. So of course, all of her friends insist on coming over and having a party. So I see this party as, that sort of crazy party at breakfast at Tiffany's. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but so I'm gonna read it's probably like a lot more obnoxious. So I'm gonna read just a little bit from the beginning of the book. P.J. Wallace, is that really you? And what the hell are you wearing? Screamed Suzette as she came barreling into the loft, followed by a posse of Pandy's 12 closest girlfriends. I'm back, Pandy shrieked, removing the silver sequined cardboard top hat from her head and giving a little bow. Suzette grabbed her around the shoulders and they jumped up and down like 10-year-olds. I need a drink, Megan announced. These divorce parties make me nervous. What if it happens to me? It will inevitably happen to you, and then you will get one of these. Suzette thrust her left hand under Megan's nose so she could get a closer look at the large yellow stone. 10 carats. Unfortunately, the guy who comes with it is 80 and has liver spots, but if he wants to pretend he's younger than he is, who am I to object? But you're not young either, Megan pointed out. You're nearly... Shh! Suzette glared at Megan as Pandy, right on cue, cooed at the ring in wonder. You're engaged? Not all of us have been under a rock for the past 2 years, Suzette quipped as the elevator door opened and 6 more women spilled out. Champagne in the bathtub, cupcakes in the kitchen, cigarettes in the living room, Pandy said by way of greeting. What about men? Do we get men in the bedroom? One of the women screamed, sending the others into peals of nervous laughter. Do you think Johnny thought you spent too much time working? Asked her friend Angie. Pandy laughed and put her arm around Angie's slight shoulders. Of course I spent too much time working, she said loudly, as much for herself as for the benefit of the crowd. What woman isn't forced to spend too much time working these days? And if men don't like it, too bad. If you're in a relationship with me, I come with a career, just like Johnny came with his career. And all those restaurants Nancy injected, breezing by. Pandy smiled stiffly. He doesn't actually own those restaurants. Do you just totally hate him right now? Amanda was on the verge of a gossip orgasm. Let's just say I'll never do that again, Pandy said. The elevator doors opened and another gaggle of women rushed out. Pandy, Portia screamed, look at you. You're so brave, standing there in that skin-tight silver dress and looking like a goddess. Is it true? Shrieked Brittany. I heard Johnny tried to get money out of you from Monica. How could he do that? He didn't even know you when you started writing Monica. Ladies, please, Pandy addressed her rapt audience. When it comes to divorce, what's fair and logical is the first thing that goes right out the window. Johnny was threatening to go after the rights to Monica. He thought I'd be so terrified he might get them, I'd give him the loft instead. So what did you give him, Portia chirped. Not the loft, and certainly not Monica. You gave him money, didn't you? Suzette scolded. Oh, I knew this would happen. Didn't I tell you this would happen? She looked around at the women closest to her, who nodded. I predicted this, she continued. I said, Pandy is such a softie, you just watch. She'll end up giving him all her money. For a moment, Pandy grimaced. If only her friends knew how true that was. But hopefully, with the success of her new book, no one would need to know the truth about anything, including her marriage. But he's got tons of his own money, Megan cried. Not as much as you'd think, Nancy chimed in. Those chefs have all their income tied up in the real estate for the restaurants. Do you think he was having an affair? Angie asked breathlessly. Pandy smiled queasily. Andy was the most naive of her friends. Surely she'd heard the rumors about Johnny's infidelities. But Pandy had already had quite a bit of champagne, and feeling puckish, she said, let me put it this way. If he wasn't having an affair, it wasn't from lack of trying. She guffawed loudly. The party had officially begun. By 7 p.m., the loft was packed. The air was filled with steam from various inhalers, along with actual cigarette smoke. Strewn around the loft were cracked plastic cocktail glasses, sticky napkins, and empty bottles of champagne. In the midst of their celebration, her agent, Henry, arrived. Look, Cary Grant is here, Pandy heard Portia shout, followed by Suzette's curt reply. Cary Grant is dead. That's Pandy's agent. Any word, Pandy screamed, rushing towards Henry with so much enthusiasm she knocked over several drinks in the process. On what? Henry asked, coolly raising his eyebrows as he surveyed the room. Almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. On the book. Hello, remember, the book, that thing I've been writing for the last 2 years? Pandy waved her hands in front of his face. Henry didn't blink. If I had word, you'd be the first to know. He squeezed Pandy's shoulder reassuringly. He stayed another whole 5 minutes before he was forced to flee, claiming he didn't want to end up in a meat sandwich between Suzette and Nancy. A new Monica book, cried Angie. Despite the booty-shaking beat now blaring from the speakers, she'd somehow managed to overhear Pandy's conversation. I knew it, Brittany shrieked. Now that Pandy's divorced, Monica will have to get divorced too. Then she can try online dating. And a matchmaker, that would be hilarious. What would be even more hilarious would be watching Monica try to arrange a date by texting. And then she can date some hot young studs with their own hair and actual muscles. I don't know about you, Amanda added, but now that I'm dating younger guys, I personally can't stand men my age anymore. It's fine if you're already with one, but otherwise, I agree. If I want to look at an old guy, I can look at my husband, said another woman. I suppose you could if you ever saw him. And what is that supposed to mean? Texting? Divorce? A matchmaker? No, that isn't Monica, Pandy thought. She had to stop this. Hold on, she shouted. Monica isn't getting divorced. But everything that happens to you happens to Monica, right? Brittany squawked. Not anymore, Pandy declared, suddenly remembering her new, very un-Monica book and how it would force the critics to take her seriously. This was something that would never happen to Monica. No one took Monica seriously at all. And could you blame them? look at her right now. Look at her friends. Portia was sitting on the kitchen counter, her too short dress riding up her thighs, while Nancy was inadvertently sloshing champagne on the front of Angie's shirt and extolling the virtues of, I'm not even going to say it. Let's just say waxing. Pandy held up her hand for order. As a matter of fact, I do have a new book coming out. When? Someone asked. Well, I don't really know, she said. I just finished it last week, as a matter of fact. Pandemonium, James Wallace, Suzette crowed. You naughty girl, why didn't you tell us before? Now we can stop celebrating your divorce and start celebrating your new book. She held up a bottle of champagne. To PJ, to Monica, to PJ and Monica. Pandy groaned. She passed through the crowd to the couch. I have an announcement. You have a new boyfriend, Amanda gasped. For a moment, Pandy put her face in her hands. Then she climbed onto the couch, standing precariously with one foot on the cushion and one foot on the arm for balance. As she was climbing, she noticed that the sun was about to set. Hello, over here, she said, waving her arms. Most of the women were no longer paying attention. Hello, me here, wanting to say something. Suzette heard her voice, turned around and shushed the crowd. Our hostess wants to say something. Hey, Pandy's talking. Be polite. As the noise level dropped, Pandy was quite sure she heard the words needs Botox and still totally naive about Johnny, although not necessarily in that order. Then Angie handed her an open bottle of champagne, and Pandy took a swig and gave it back. She touched her mouth with her fingertips. I have an announcement, she repeated, scanning the room. Everyone was listening now. I can't tell you how much it means to me that you're all here. You all know how much I love you. Aw, we love you too, goobers. Pandy bowed her head in thanks, waiting for them to settle down. I want to thank you all for coming, she said, because this is a celebration of not only moving forward, but also of letting go of the past. Pandy glanced back at the billboard, and the billboard is a billboard of Monica. The sun had set, and for the moment, Monica had disappeared. One of the things I learned during this divorce, Pandy continued, is that I probably never should have gotten married in the first place. But then my insecurities got the better of me. No matter how stupid it is, if you've never been married, it's all you can think about. It's always there in the back of your mind. What's wrong with me? How come no one's ever wanted me? And it's important not to get caught up in society's expectations. Men in the bedroom, someone shouted. Pandy laughed. In any case, what I've realized is that I have to grow up, which means I can't keep on being Monica. Oh, go on, Nancy hooted. You are Monica. Pandy shook her head. Not anymore. I don't want to be, partly because if I stay like Monica, I'm going to end up with another Johnny. Forget about Johnny. You were too good for him. Oh, men will be lining up to meet you. You'll see, Suzette cackled. No, Pandy playfully pointed her finger at Suzette. They line up to meet you. But that's sort of the problem. If you have a man, great. But it shouldn't have to be about men. And we already know this. But sometimes it takes getting divorced to learn that lesson all over again. Pandy's mouth was suddenly dry. She motioned to Angie for the bottle. While she drank, she heard Brittany ask, did Johnny really have 14 suitcases full of knives? Shh, Nancy said. And so, Pandy said quickly, I will keep this short. I do have a new book coming out, and it is not about Monica. It's what I'm calling a me book, meaning it's the book I've always wanted to write, and I've finally taken the chance to write it. I hope you're not disappointed. About Monica, she paused, and the fact that I definitely don't have a new man. We're almost out of champagne, Portia screamed, as if a nuclear bomb were about to go off. Music, Megan shouted. What happened to the music? Pandy picked up her sequin top hat and placed it on her head. As she turned to step off the couch, the lights that bathed Monica's image every evening at 8 p.m. sharp suddenly flooded her face. Pandy took a step backward. The heel of her shoe caught in one of the tears in the cracked leather of the couch. She went down. Thank you. So now what I'd like to do is some questions and answers. I'm sure everybody's got lots of Sex in the City questions. So, and I think there's some people upstairs. I don't know if they want to ask questions, but yes. Oh, yes. Well, I started writing actually at a really, really young age. And I have two younger sisters, one sister who's a year younger. So when we were kids, we shared a room together. And, I learned to read, I think at a very early age when I was before I was 4, because I would see my parents reading and I just couldn't stand the fact that somebody was doing something that seemed so interesting and I couldn't do it. So I guess I apparently taught myself to read. But my sister, when we were kids, we weren't allowed to watch TV. So we always had to be doing something constructive, which meant telling stories and putting on little plays and that sort of thing. So I really started telling stories at about 4 or 5. And my sister and I, before we went to sleep at night, after our parents read to us, we would tell our own little stories. And they were not nearly as good as the stories that our parents were reading. But our favorite story was about people in our neighborhood they'd go into the bathroom and then they would get flushed down the toilet. And then they would come up in somebody else's bathroom and shock that person. And we thought that was literally the funniest thing that we've ever heard. But at the age of 8, that was when I think I said out loud that I wanted to be a novelist. So I'm one of those people who knew at a very early age what I wanted to do. And it really was it was my guiding light. And no matter how bad things got, I always thought I'm going to be a writer someday and it's all going to somehow work out. And I started when I was a teenager writing short stories, and then I would go to the library, and there was a book in the library called Writer's Market, and this of course was before the internet because it was the 70s. And I would copy out the names of the editors and agents, and I would send off my little stories, and I actually have a couple of these little stories and little cards that they sent back, thank you so much. Some of it was form letters. This isn't right for us, but occasionally I would get something like, well, you do seem to have talent. Do you have anything else to show us? I was like, not really, I'm 17. This is kind of my output at this point. And then when I moved, I went to Rice University, and I took all the writing courses there. And at 19, I decided, okay, this is it. Now it's time to get on with my real life, which is living in New York and being a writer. And so I moved to New York at 19, and I really, really thought that somehow miraculously I was just going to start writing novels and someone would publish the novel. And I also used to write little children's books. So I'd written this children's story, and I sent it to Simon & Schuster. And I got a phone call from the editor-in-chief of the children's book department. And she said, will you come in and have a meeting? So I said yes. So I went in, and she said, well, you should definitely be a children's book writer. And so she gave me an assignment, which they were doing this little series. It was supposed to be like Pat the Bunny, but it was Dress the Bear. So I wrote this little book about, Dress the Bear. And honestly, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And it was really eye-opening because it was my first experience being a, quote, professional writer. And, until then, I'd always written when the inspiration struck. But this was a completely different ball of wax. And so I wrote the little story and I think I had to rewrite it, and that was like really traumatic because I had, when you're young, you have so many expectations, and you don't want to do anything wrong, and so then what happened was they discontinued the series. Because people wanted to pat the bunny, but they did not want to dress the bear. But after that, I literally would just go up to people who I met and say, I'm a writer, hire me. And at that time, there were a lot of little startup newspapers in New York. It was a very creative time. And I guess the equivalent would be people starting blogs today. But back then they were starting these little newspapers. So there were quite a few of these little newspapers around. And so I wrote these little stories, and when they got published, I put them in a little portfolio. And then when I was, I also used to model in punk fashion shows. You'd get paid maybe $50, or you would get some clothes, which the clothes were really strange. Like I got when I actually got a job, I had all these very strange clothes. Like I had this white vinyl jumpsuit, but I was modeling in one of these fashion shows, and I was wearing a white plastic dress with clear plastic cutouts, and there was a photographer there, and the photo ended up in the Sunday New York Times magazine. And my parents, who rarely read the New York Times back then, were on vacation with their friends who always read the New York Times. And their friends said, "Oh my God, isn't that your daughter?" So then I got a call from my mother, and she said, "I think you better go back to college." So I went to NYU, and I was one of the first people in this new division that they started called the Gallatin Division. And it was for students who knew what they wanted to do. And you could take any courses that you wanted within, the university from any department. And you had to do a lot of internships. And then you had to do an oral test on the great books. So I really took advantage of that. And, again, I think I was probably 20, but I was interning at a PR firm, and I was writing press releases. So I started pretty early, and I was always very determined to make it, but it took a lot longer than I thought it would. So that was how I started. Another question. Okay, so the question is, did my fashion impact Sex and the City, and did I know that Sex and the City would be so timeless? It did in a way, because when we first started doing the series, there was a lot of, actually, when we did the pilot, Patricia Field, she didn't do the fashion for the pilot. Somebody else did the fashion, and we did the pilot in 1997, and then it was nearly a whole year went by before we knew whether or not it would be a series. And Darren Star, who was the producer, hated talking about fashion. And I remember one day I was on the set, and there were all questions like, what should the characters be wearing? And he was like, I don't know. Don't bother me with this fashion stuff. He said, just have Carrie Bradshaw dress like her. And he pointed at me. So I suppose, in some small way, I may have influenced it. But it was Patricia Field, who, when I first came to New York, she was part of that punk fashion scene. And she had a store on 8th Street called Patricia Field. And it was like the coolest store in New York. And it was so cool. I remember going in there and walking out I'm not cool enough. As far as Sex and the City being timeless, I don't think any of us realized how timeless it would be. And in fact, when I started writing the column was really about dating and mating rituals in New York. And I was really looking for like strange things that I thought only happened in New York. For instance, the modelizers, the guys who would only date models, and the bicycle boys, guys who would bring their bike into your tiny apartment. And we really thought, like, this crazy stuff can only be happening in New York, but it actually turned out to be happening in other places as well. And I think the questions that Sex and the City brings up are, about relationships and love and our girlfriends and being single. Those are still things that women are going through today, at some point in their life, if they're, in their early 20s, or, as you said, if you're a little bit older and then you've gotten divorced and you're out in the dating world again. But I think those are things that women we're always interested in, and we'll always be talking about them. I mean, we live in a country that is pretty obsessed with relationships. I just saw on Twitter something like, everybody wants to know the details of Ben Affleck's divorce. It's like, really? But we're all pretty obsessed with relationships. It's human nature. Another question. Oh, God, someone's got to have a question. Yes. Oh, you know what? That's hard to say. Oh, out of all of the characters I've written, which one is my favorite and why? That's hard to say, because whenever I'm writing, I have to fall in love with that character. And I really have to inhabit that character. So it's usually whatever character I'm working on. One of my favorite characters is actually Janie Wilcox from Trading Up. And she's a real anti-hero. And she's, if we analyzed her today, she probably would have like a borderline personality disorder. But that was a character she was always trying to further herself through men. And it was for me, it was a really interesting character to write, because the character is so opposite of me. And so it was really sort of fun to get into a character that had a completely different perspective on life. Yes. Okay, let me just take that. I don't know if I can remember all of those parts. Okay, do I have any rituals? I am really, really disciplined, and I basically construct my day around writing. And I've found, one of the things that's different for me now than it was years ago is I found as I've gotten older that I really have more concentration. And when I was younger, I was always so distracted by so many different things, relationships and going out and seeing the world and wanting to be there and be on the scene. And as I've gotten older, that's sort of faded away. And I have much more concentration, but I usually work for about 6 hours a day. So I'll get up, play with my dogs a little, make up a little song, like, oh, smoochy poochie. And then I drink Earl Grey tea. I have to have Earl Grey tea with lemon. That is my I have to have that. And then I usually start writing. And then at around 2, I'll go and do some exercise, go for a walk or a bike ride or something like that. And then I go to the store, just the regular store. I mean, just like everybody else, buy food, cook dinner, and that's usually it. But people know when I'm writing, if somebody says, hey, let's go have a drink, I'll say, okay, I will go for an hour. And I literally will go for 1 hour. And I don't know if it's good to be that way or not. But the one thing I do know is that when I'm really into a book, one of the things that I've learned is to try to put the excitement on the page and keep the life very simple and regimented. God, I was going to say something else, but now I don't remember it. So now there was another part to your question. Okay, so it's, what do I do? How do I handle writer's block? And do I feel pressure? Because now I'm a successful author. I constantly feel pressure, but I felt so much pressure also when I was in my 20s. And there's something about writing that if I don't do it, I feel really, really guilty. And it may come from the fact that in my 20s, I wrote a lot for women's magazines. And then when I was actually 34, I started writing Sex and the City. And so I was always on deadline. I feel like I've been on deadline for most of my adult life. And there certainly is pressure today in publishing. It's a business like every other business. And, publishers want to know when their book is coming and what it will be. And, they want to know what's coming. But yes.
It's cool that I'm a successful author. I'll get it to you when I can.
Oh, God, no. Oh, absolutely not. There's this, I think people have an idea that, when you're successful, you can but the reality is you're really only as good as your last book. And I have deadlines, and I do have to stick to them. And also, I think one of the things that people don't understand about writers is it's not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed. Even when you have a contract, legally, they can not accept your book for a variety of reasons. So it's really one of the only professions where you can do all the work and not get paid. And you can't, they used to sort of let it slide a little bit if you had a contract, they would maybe let it slide for a couple of years, but they don't do that anymore. And in fact, I think a couple of years ago, there was a little bit of a flutter in the publishing world because a lot of publishers canceled contracts that they had with writers that the writers hadn't fulfilled. So then you have to give the advance back, which is something that people also don't understand. So it's not an easy profession, and it's very competitive, and there definitely is a lot of pressure. And in terms of writer's block, writer's block is part of the process. And when I'm writing a book, I'll start at the beginning. And I'll kind of go as far as I can get, which usually is about 50 to 80 pages. And as someone said to me, anybody can write a great first 50 pages of a novel, but 99% of people cannot get any farther than 50 to 100 pages. And so when I get to that point, that is always a push, and I usually have to go back to the beginning and look at like what's going on at the beginning, and I have to change that, and then I keep going back to the beginning until I can push it along and push it along. And I do a lot of drafts. And when I first start writing, one of the ways that I've sort of will convince myself to do it is that I say, it's just like a musician. Just pretend you're going into the studio and you're laying down tracks. Just put something down on paper, because you can do things, you can change what's on the paper, and you can do things with what's on the page, but you can't do much with what's in your head. So you really have to get it out onto the proverbial paper, because of course it's just the screen. And I do get to points where I am stuck, and if it goes on for longer than 3 or 4 days, it's really a nightmare. And I found the thing to do is, everybody says get up and walk away. I found that's the worst thing to do. The best thing to do is just sit there and wrestle with it and beat yourself up mentally. But that's one of the reasons why when I get into the writer's head and I've got a flow going, I will try to write 6 days a week. Because when I stop, when I get out of that head and I have to get back into that head, it can take a couple of days. And so I know if people are always like, come, let's go away for the weekend. It's like, I'd love to, but I know on Monday, I'm going to lose like Monday, Tuesday, and half of Wednesday trying to get back into the book. So it's hard. And when I was younger, I used to completely freak out, but now I've done it so many times that I just remind myself that it's part of the process. But every time one's writing a book, it doesn't get any easier. For some reason, it's still just as hard as it was the first time around. So, yes. Okay, the question is, there are 13 banks owned by women. And have I ever written about any women who owned banks in America? I would love to. I wrote a book called Lipstick Jungle that was about really successful women. And it was a TV series on NBC. And it's one of those things where the audience says that they want books about successful women, but when we read about successful women, there's a lot of criticism directed at successful career women, which is something that, we see, it happens all the time. Like Sheryl Sandberg and her book, Lean In, she got a lot of flack for that book. So if you're going to write about successful women, you really have to be prepared there's a lot of pushback for some strange reason, which I don't understand. And it's, I look at something like 50 Shades of Grey, which is just really all about sex and, it's a relationship. And I don't know why, but it seems like women in some ways are more comfortable reading about relationships than they are really reading about successful women. And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know what it's about. I don't know if it's because we're all so ingrained with that fairy tale, romantic Cinderella kind of story. I don't know if it's because there's so much pressure on women to be in relationships, and, we still tell women that getting a man is really the ultimate kind of goal. We live in a world where we say that isn't true and women can do everything, but it's still tricky territory. It really is. And I don't know if it's because, when you write about a really successful woman, it makes other women feel like, oh my God, now I've got to be, besides, taking care of the kids and everything, now I have to be super, super successful. I don't know what it is, but it seems, it's still true that I think the majority of the audience, they want to read about relationships. And at the end of this book, the character does not end up with a man. And that's always a really, really big risk to take. I don't know why. Maybe things will slowly change. I don't know. But that's a very good question. Yes. Okay, the question is, who are my favorite writers and what books have shaped me? My favorite writers are really, I always look to the classics. I love Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary and Vanity Fair, and they're really society novels. And all these books are about woman versus society, where the question is, how can she be a whole person in a society that demands that she's married and has children? And, the giving up of the self in going along with society's expectations. And it's trickier to write that now because, oddly, we really do expect women to be able to do it all and conquer everything. And, there's this sort of idea out there that if your life isn't working, it's your fault. So there's a lot of pressure on women, I think, to make everything work. And, that's the idea really behind Monica, is that, we all have this pressure to make sure that everything in our life is perfect. And the reality is that, nobody has that power over their life. Things happen. Yes?
How long does it usually take you to write a book?
It takes a couple of years. If I'm lucky, it would take maybe a year. This book, with this book, it took about 2.5 years to write for some reason. I don't know why. And actually before that, I was writing another book. And I'd written a lot of this other book. And I started with the character's childhood. And then after 400 pages, they were still in their early 20s. And my agent was like, "What's the plot?" I was like, "It's just their lives." No. And so she actually said to me, she said, this book isn't gelling. So I had to put that book down. And that was when I started writing Killing Monica. So I had to come up with a totally new idea, new characters. And it's not the first time that it's happened in my life. It's happened 2 or 3 times where I will spend, a good 9 months or a year on something that just doesn't come together. And you just sort of see the money draining out of your bank account. Because if you don't publish, you don't have any income. So it's scary. But as a creative person, you have to be willing to go through it. Okay, the question is, do I work with a 2 or 3 book contract? I do. I usually have a 2 book contract. And right now I have two book contracts. So I have 2 books with my current publisher and then 2 young adult books with another publisher. So actually, as soon as I get back from my book tour, I have to start writing another book, which I actually have started. I think I've written about 50 pages or so. But I know I'm going to get a call from my agent, like, we are going to need like 200 pages by Christmas. I know it. So I got to knuckle down. One more question, yes. Okay, the question is, when I start a book, do I have a clear idea of where I'm going? I will have a vague idea. And I usually have a sort of overarching idea. Like when I wrote 1 Fifth Avenue, I really wanted to explore the idea that New York doesn't really change, and that, in a sense, people in New York take on certain roles, and that that's always being, it's like there's always a younger person who's going to come in and be amazed by the glitz and glamour, and not understand like what the other characters have gone through. But it's that idea of renewal. It's like there's always people are always new young people are always coming to New York to live the dream. So that was the idea with that book. Okay, do we have time for one more question? Or I guess we have time for one more question. Does anyone? Yes.
The scene you read from today, it sounded like maybe the part where people were giving the author advice about, you should have her text, maybe has a little realism that you might have experienced. I was wondering what an outlandish suggestion someone has given you about your own characters might have been.
Well, it's funny because that is true. People do always come up to writers, but actually what most people do is they want you to write their book. And what's funny, when I was writing Sex and the City, I often get this question of, were people afraid of you? Were they afraid that you were going to write about their lives? And actually the opposite was true. So many people would come up to me and say, have I got a story for you? I want you to write this story. And I'll tell you the craziest thing I ever heard when I was writing Sex and the City, and this is probably the craziest thing of my whole career, but a man came up to me and he said, you've got to go to this party. They have it once a week. And he said, the men wear diapers and the women are dressed as nurses. And I was like, I just don't think I can do that. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to sign some books. Thank you so much for coming.